At long last, Graham Hancock has Graham Hancock has okay. At long last, Graham Hancock has what the fuck? At long last, Graham Hancock has gotten his own high-ish quality documentary series. For those who don't know, Graham Hancock is a figure in the archaeological and historical sphere who was a journalist by trade. Hancock has taken a lot of flack from archaeologists for his theories about human prehistory. He has a bunch of ideas, but his basic thesis is that advanced civilization actually started much earlier than the 4000 BC timeframe that we know today, but instead during the last ice age. This advanced civilization, or civilizations, are thought by Hancock to have collapsed around the time of the Younger Dryas period around 13,000 years ago due to sudden catastrophic changes in the world that caused massive flooding and climate change, perhaps initiated by asteroid impacts. While there's a lot that goes into Graham's theories that I won't fully discuss here, certain pieces of evidence, including the level of water erosion on the Sphinx, the existence of Gobekli Tepe, and the general trend in archaeology that things just keep getting older, are the main linchpins to his hypothesis, at least in my opinion. Many of you likely now see why he's called a kook, if you didn't already know. However, Hancock has maintained a large following, with his numbers only growing over the last decade thanks to many appearances on the podcast that's run by his personal friend Joe Rogan. Maybe you've heard of him. In November of 2022, Hancock came onto the Joe Rogan Experience with amateur geologist Randall Carlson to once again outline his theory, and of course to promote his new show, Ancient Apocalypse, which we'll analyze in this video today. But first, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Ancient Apocalypse, at least in my opinion, is sort of eh. If we look at the entertainment value for a second, it's relatively well done, especially in terms of cinematography and animations, which do a great job at reviving ancient myths, as well as portraying how archaeological sites looked like in their heyday. On this front, Ancient Apocalypse is probably the best produced counter-historical show I've seen, topping Ancient Aliens and things of that nature for sure. But in my personal opinion, Hancock's show kind of falls short with Hancock himself. He seems somewhat self-important in the show, although part of that is just the constant slew of shoots of him epically riding in a jeep towards a site in a foreign country. His guests are also generally not very good in front of the camera, and they are given pretty short screen time, usually with awfully delivered or short lines occasionally in lingering camera shots. Even Joe Rogan seems kinda strange and awkward on the show, and he quickly appears in one episode just to say how cool Graham Hancock is before he disappears for another 6 episodes. There's also a crap ton of filler in most of the installments. As interesting as his thoughts are, on any given site he can probably only fill about 15 minutes of info before he has to start repeating himself or talking about how much archaeology hates him, which is true, but he kind of beats the dead horse. The one exception is probably the last episode, which looks at the Younger Dryas impact theory, and in that episode there's definitely not enough information to fully explain the more rigorous evidence base. Overall, the show really has the feel of a History Channel series, and if you downgrade the cinematography a bit, it would be indistinguishable from a show in 2008 that has like the dramatic musical effects whenever someone says something, and there's a lot of Graham just standing there, and it's like, oh, did you know, important history stuff, blah, blah, blah. I have a theory. And, you know, compared to other counter-history shows, it's great, and I think the only show in this genre that beats it out is Hunting Hitler, thanks YouTube, which, while it may have run a bit long, is a genuinely entertaining show for a lot of it. Personally, I think if Graham was joined by a guest, and there was some not so scripted dialogue between them, the series probably would have been a lot better, but it sort of feels like a PowerPoint presentation with really good visuals, except for the narration shots, which get way too close to Graham's face and it just feels kinda awkward. There's also the cutaway narration parts where it looks like he's filming in a broom closet. But I think if they had done a thing where, you know, Joe Rogan accompanies him and he just said, wow, or exhaled or made chimp noises every once in a while, and Graham talked to him more than the camera, then I think the show would have been pretty killer, actually. Overall, I'd say if you're curious about Graham and the places he talks about, this is a good start. Check out his show on Netflix. But any Joe Rogan podcast that he appears on provides far more actual information. Now let's move on to the content itself, which I actually want to discuss conceptually more and with a bigger scope, rather than trying to debunk or prove every point he makes. I'm sure people are going to disagree with a bunch of what he says here, which I'm just going to kind of reiterate. First is Gunung Padang in Indonesia, which I think Graham makes a pretty good case for. The structure is definitively man-made, evidenced by the presence of a mortar substance in between the rocks, the unnatural orientation, and the fact that these rocks came from another place and did not actually naturally occur in that specific spot. Some evidence dates the construction back to around the birth of Christ, but others insist that it's much older, dating to around the time of the Ice Age, although this is definitely a fringe theory. Next, we see the Cholula Temple in Mexico, which, while relatively new, has been the site of multiple older structures recognized by the wider archaeological community going as far back as 500 BC. It is also the largest pyramid in terms of base size in the world. Nothing we see here actually places the site to be older than the 500 BC mark, and not even Graham says that definitively. But here he introduces a thread of relaying mythology, starting here with the tale of Quetzalcoatl and his arrival after a flood on twin serpents to teach the Mexicans about civilization, as well as a myth of giants creating pyramids. He also shows the prevalence of snake imagery on other sites in the area. Following this is the Gigantea site in Malta. Here Graham focuses on the astrological orientation of the various temples in Malta, and using this discerns that Gigantea is the oldest and most advanced of the Maltesian sites, a reversal of the trend that we see in Mexico, where things actually get worse with time rather than in the Mexican instance they get better. He also zooms in on the discovery of Neanderthal teeth in Malta from the Ice Age, a discovery that has largely been ignored by archaeologists who tend to insist that settlement on the islands didn't start until much later. Once again, a myth is revealed revolving around a giantess who teaches people how to build megalithic structures. The Egyptian myth of Osiris sailing around bringing civilization to people is also mentioned, which makes sense given Malta's proximity to Egypt. The next one is also quite interesting and focuses on the Bimini Road. Off the coast of the Bahamas. At first glance, the road looks somewhat man-made, but nothing too spectacular, just a line of rocks about 50 feet underwater. But Hancock dives to explore these rocks, and coupled with a sonar device, establishes that they are in fact separate stones, and not just made of a shelf of rock, and more interestingly, that there are small foundation rocks underneath to keep and maintain those top stones level in a way that seems very man-made. In some ways, I think this is Graham's most interesting piece of evidence and episode, as the structure, at least in my opinion, is almost certainly artificial, and the area that it's in hasn't been above water since the close of the last ice age, and the known cultures that have inhabited the island didn't seem to have dealt in megalithic structures, so unless some native group decided to cut out these massive stones and then put them on boats to make an underwater road to nothing, and then drop them at the bottom of the ocean perfectly and make it level, it seems that this is some evidence of a somewhat advanced group that lived in the area during the last ice age, at least to me. But we'll get more critical later. Graham doesn't get into local mythology, but instead looks at the tale of Atlantis and posits that the Bahamas may be the location of this historical city. Graham also looks at antique maps that seem to show Antarctica and a pre-Ice Age Bahamas, despite the continent not being discovered until much later. The map makers, according to Graham, claim to have modeled their maps on much earlier, now lost maps. Graham uses this to support a hypothesis that an ancient seafaring group that mapped the world and may have brought civilization to other areas in accordance with the other two myths existed. Another interesting discovery appears in episode 5, where Graham looks at the famous Gobekli Tepe site in Turkey. Gobekli Tepe is easily the most powerful archaeological evidence Graham has, since the site was made around 9000 BC, 5,000 years before the first advanced civilizations. The site has large cut stones and impressive engraved pictographs, as well as various other parts that have yet to be excavated. Graham then visits a newly discovered site, Karahan Tepe, that seems to be from around the same time and has similarly impressive construction. It is thought that Gobekli Tepe was actually intentionally buried, and its orientation may have been towards the Sirius star like the Malta sites, which backs up the claim that the site was made long ago and that this would have been around the time that Sirius was oriented as such in the sky. This site also has the advantage of being widely accepted as 11,000 years old by the archaeological community, and it's the most stable evidence that Graham has for some advanced civilization at the close of the Ice Age. After that, Graham returns to North America and looks at Poverty Point and Snake Mound monuments in the central US. Here, astronomy makes a comeback, as does renewed rebuffing of Graham's beliefs, most notably shown when the Snake Mound groundskeepers refuse Hancock's team access to the site for filming. He does, however, get a ranger to admit that the purpose of one of the sites is unknown, and that its dating is difficult as well. Mythology is featured again and looks at an Iroquois legend of a giant snake bringing about a great flood. He then travels to Turkey to explore the Derinkuyu underground city. Once again, the date for this has been pushed back from its original date, moving from the Middle Ages to the early centuries BC. Further, nearby sites have found Neolithic-era stone tools that date to the period Graham keeps talking about, and he posits that the tools could be used to hew the earliest caves here. The caves also present a mystery on why they were created, as they seem to be made for very long-term settlement and are in the middle of nowhere. While archaeologists posit that there were places for people to hide from invaders, Graham counters that said invaders could simply block off the entrances and kill the entire population very easily, and it doesn't really match the blueprint of how caves are utilized by other guerrilla groups. They're not near settlements, and they're way too long-term, for example. Also, the caves are very large and could house many people, not just a handful of fighters. Instead, he contends that these caves may have been made for populations to survive natural disasters like meteor showers. He then recounts the local tale of how a brutal winter forced a local patriarch to build an underground city to preserve the best and brightest of the world from catastrophe. In the last episode, Graham travels back to North America, where he discusses the catastrophe he has been referencing through the whole series. Graham subscribes to the Younger Dryas impact theory, which posits that around the time of the Younger Dryas, a series of meteors struck Earth and the ice caps, rapidly melting glaciers while simultaneously cooling the Earth in a nuclear winter-esque scenario. The result was the destruction of any advanced civilizations at the time, which were likely to be closer to the sea and thus submerged, while the colder temperatures for hundreds of years solidly ended any large-scale agricultural ventures. Graham's evidence for this mostly stems from evidence of comet impacts in the soil of various parts of the world, including Mexico, which contain elements almost only found in extraterrestrial bodies and are indicative of comet strikes in other parts of the geological record. The geological analysis of Randall Carlson also supports Graham's ideas, as he claims that many of the dramatic landscapes in the northwestern US were the result of rapid, high-volume flooding consistent with large parts of the ice cap melting extremely quickly, say, from being struck by an asteroid. The striking of the ice cap would also explain why we have yet to discover any impact sites for the proposed meteors. That being said, they didn't find the impact for the meteor that killed the dinosaurs until the 70s, I think. The torrid meteor stream, which Graham references as well, also occurs at certain times a year and may have been responsible for the disasters, and the position in the night sky from which they would have come from may actually be recorded in the Gobekli Tepe monument as a warning. So now that we've gone over that, I want to talk a bit about the criticism of Graham Hancock, both for and against him. starting with what I think Graham really gets wrong, and I'm obviously not the first person to point this out. I think he has some God of the Gaps syndrome. God of the Gaps is essentially a theological argument, but the basic premise can apply to most everything, especially on the fringes of human understanding. The original God of the Gaps fallacy is about what it sounds like. Gaps in our scientific knowledge of the universe are explainable by God. Since the gap is unknown, anyone can come up with any explanation for this gap, and they can't really be proven otherwise. The most well-known example today would be the Big Bang. Since we don't really know how the Big Bang happened, many people fill the gap in scientific understanding with, "It's because God did it." The issue with this general reasoning, of course, is that it only works for as long as we don't have the answer to something. For example, let's say your coworker shows up late for work. You don't know why, but you say to other people, "It's because they were partying last night and overslept and were hungover." If another coworker challenges you on that, you can respond by simply asking them to figure out why they're late, but they don't know either, so they can't actually disprove you. The whole thing can eventually be put to rest, however, when you do really learn that there was just a lot of traffic and that's why he was late. The thing is, your partying claim can't actually be disproven until you know for sure what happened. This is a gap in understanding, and you fill it with really whatever you want. Even if there's a little bit of evidence to go with it, you can't know for sure, but also you can't be disproven for sure. If we replaced the coworkers with Graham and archaeology, it would be something like this. The late coworker is the existence of Gobekli Tepe, or just some other kind of unexplainable pieces of archaeological evidence. Archaeology doesn't have a great understanding of why Gobekli Tepe exists or who the people were that made it. Graham then comes in and says the reason Gobekli Tepe and all of these other things that exist is because there was an advanced civilization that existed during the Ice Age and discovered Antarctica and may or may not have levitated the pyramids with their minds. And yes, he does actually say this, although he doesn't make it his main points, obviously. Understandably, we may look at this and think that Graham is kind of jumping to conclusions. It's true, archaeology doesn't have a good explanation either, but that doesn't mean that Graham is right. To further illustrate how flawed this logic is, I will posit that the reason Gobekli Tepe exists is that aliens from Neptune wanted to play Neptune ping pong, and that the rules of the game actually require a court shaped just like Gobekli Tepe. You're probably saying, that is very far-fetched. What is your evidence? And I might say, we have no evidence of settlement around Gobekli Tepe, and some of the megaliths kinda look like ping pong paddles for really big people. Also, you can't prove me wrong. And I'm right, you can't actually prove me wrong. As you can see, filling the unknown with alternative theories and a little bit of evidence to them isn't particularly sound logically, and to some degree, Graham definitely does this. Is it possible he's right? Yes. Are there also a bunch of other explanations that are more tame? Yes. All I'm saying here is that Graham's conclusions aren't any more evidenced than a myriad of other explanations. That being said, Graham certainly has some points. For one, there are many instances of circular logic in the archaeological community. One of the more obvious ones, which Graham doesn't talk about in this series, is the issue of the erosion on the Sphinx in Egypt. Here, erosion patterns, especially on the walls carved out next to the Sphinx, are consistent with rock that has been exposed to significant rain for long periods of time, and such rain has not affected Egypt since the Younger Dryas era. The rebuttal to this is not that the water patterns aren't actually consistent with that, rather the argument is that, well, we already know when the Sphinx was made and it wasn't that long ago, so the erosion pattern can't be that old. This of course dodges the argument and makes another one, thus creating an inconsistency in the scientific record. Another point, which Graham makes with his shirt on his JRE appearance before the show aired, is that things really kind of do seem to keep getting older. Throughout the history of archaeology, we have generally been finding that things were older than we initially thought. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is in America. For much of the 20th century, the so-called Clovis civilization is thought to have been the first group in the Americas, settling around 10,000 years ago. However, more and more evidence of older settlements kept coming up, but Clovis stood strong, and established archaeologists that cut their teeth on this actively blacklisted others that denied Clovis first, and there was really a lot of censorship in that sense, another point that Graham talks about a lot. All of this, by the way, is summarized in the very mainstream history book 1491 by Charles Mann, so you know I'm not just reiterating a Graham Hancock talking point. Even a linguistic study showed that there must have been multiple waves of settlement over the Americas, and that they must have been older than Clovis. Over time, the date for humans in the Americas has gotten older and older, now around 25 to 35,000 years ago, and Clovis first really is a dead belief with no good backing, and it's just outdated. But even still, it's quite popular. I remember when I was a kid watching the History Channel, and they talked about Clovis being first. Michael Shermer brings it up when he debates Graham Hancock, and it is thoroughly shut down. Jared Diamond talks about it in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, which, to be fair, was kind of still while Clovis was the main belief. And even if you Google when people first came to America, it gives you the Clovis answer, but it's just not really true anymore. And even this 30,000-year figure might be changing as well. The Clovis first debate is a good encapsulation of the fight Graham sees himself in. A new idea pushing the dates back on human development, but being pilloried by the establishment only to eventually be proven right. Another example of unknown civilizations recently being discovered is in the Indus Valley Civilization, which was discovered in 1921 and is now recognized to have been inhabited since 7000 BC, and to have also been one of the oldest advanced civilizations in human history when we really didn't think there was anything in that region of the world. For Graham, Gobekli Tepe is his best hill to fight on, since it is universally accepted to have been made at close to the time of the end of the Ice Age, long before advanced civilization or any other form of megalithic structure building. That being said, there is still so much missing from Graham's theories, like where are the other settlements, where's the agriculture, where are the metal tools, how come we don't see more consistent evidence of older structures, why does he keep using this annoying and illogical straw man argument that hunter-gatherers just woke up one morning and decided to make these structures, and then says, oh, that's totally implausible, it must have been the other group of people that just woke up one morning and decided to make these structures. And Graham has some counterpoints, namely that the disaster he talks about would have erased much of that evidence, or at least sunk it underwater to areas that haven't really been explored, or that archaeologists tend to stop digging when they hit something, precluding the possibility of finding an older, deeper settlement, which is also fair. Also, the concept of alternative technology makes sense. After all, just because a society has the ability to make and use a certain tech doesn't necessarily mean that they actually invent it, because they just never thought of it or had a different path of evolution. For example, American Indians never invented the wheel outside of toys, and Europeans didn't make highly efficient moldboard style plows until hundreds of years after the Chinese. So overall, what do I think of Graham's ideas? I'll go out on a limb here and say that I think it's perfectly plausible that some advanced civilizations existed during the Ice Age and were erased by the Younger Dryas era. When I say advanced civilizations, I am referring to groups that were able to create food surpluses that were large enough to allow for castes of non-laboring people who could organize and build the non-essential structures like we see Gobekli Tepe, etc., etc. They may not have had agriculture, they may not have even had metal tools, and maybe not even writing, but they were certainly more organized, advanced, and larger than the small hunting bands that we currently believe to have existed. These hunter-gatherer groups were probably the majority of the world, and as Graham points out, there has always been a coexistence of nomads and sedentary groups throughout history. For example, the Huns and the Romans existed on the same continent at the same time. One was Rome, albeit much reduced in its power by this point, and one was an illiterate group that barely had cities. I'm going to be making a video on these two next time we have a video, so stick around for that one. Also, I don't think the events of the Younger Dryas would have had to have been as catastrophic as Hancock claims, although I think that's totally plausible as well. Alright, so that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. If you want to learn more about this, go watch Graham's series Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix. Watch his accompanying appearance on Joe Rogan from November of 2022. Can't remember the number off the top of my head. Watch some of his other episodes. He's one of Joe's earliest and most consistent guests. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. And I hope you have a great day. Goodbye.